What's going on, guys? Nick here, and welcome. So, before we start actually learning how to learn, I want to just take a second and talk a little bit more about where I myself am coming from and why me and Shoma designed this course the way that it is. So, as to where I'm coming from, when I finished my Bachelor's of Science, I finished it with a 3.96 GPA. And the entire last year, I went to maybe 15% of my classes, if even that. That's right, I attended next to nothing. Most of my last year was me frolicking out in the sunlight, enjoying myself. The reason I could manage to do this is because I learned really early on that school is actually nowhere near as hard as most people make it out to be. It's really not. The bar for learning in the majority of academic institutions, at least for an undergraduate degree, is so low that realistically most of you guys could probably achieve at least passing grades with around 10 hours of work a week. Maybe 20 hours during finals, but to be completely honest, even that is kind of high. And in order to do that, I realized really early on that I had to commit to being as efficient as possible with the time that I did spend studying. I talk about it a lot later, so I'm not actually going to get too much into it now. But the general idea is, if I'm going to spend an hour of my life doing something, right, studying, volleyball, riding a bike, whatever, I might as well get as much done during that hour as humanly possible. Otherwise, I'm just being wasteful. That's literally it. That's the thought process that I had, luckily, very early on in my first year. And everything else that I'm going to teach follows from that one simple principle. Your time is valuable. So why waste it being anything less than 100% efficient? How I want to frame the entire idea behind studying or learning, really, is that you should always strive for as close to optimal efficiency as humanly possible. Be driven by efficiency. We're going to talk a bit later about a bunch of different techniques and methods for learning better and ultimately retaining more knowledge. But it's really, really important that you guys understand right now that every single thing that we talk about in this course is derived from that one idea, that one paradigm. Every little fix ultimately aims towards having you guys reach optimal or 100% efficiency in everything that you do. So a very important example of how to get started reaching that optimal efficiency is what's called the Pareto principle. This idea was developed by an Italian economist, appropriately named Vilfredo Pareto, and in general, the Pareto principle states that 80% of effects come from 20% of causes. And this principle is not only true in economics, but it's true in countless different natural and man-made processes alike. Just for analogy's sake, let's say you're studying for a test. What the Pareto principle means here is that 80% of the effects or 80% of the results of this test come from 20% of the causes or 20% of your actions. So, if we rewrite this Pareto principle to be a bit more in line with studying, we find that 80% of our mark on this test depends only on 20% of our studying. For those of you unacquainted with the Pareto principle, you guys, and I totally understand this, you guys are probably super incredulous right now. You're like, there's no way in hell that 80% of my grade can come entirely from only 20% of my studying. And it's just here that I want to say the numbers that Pareto used back in the day were not set in stone, right? Realistically, there's some margins, but at the end of the day, it's the underlying concept that's the most important. And that underlying concept is this. There is a small number of things that you do that is ultimately responsible for a large portion of your success in whatever domain, whether it be your marks on a test, whether it be your physique in the gym, and whether it be your success in relationships even. More or less everything. The idea here is that not all actions are equal. So, our goal is to find the methods of studying that are as high yield as possible. And we don't want to focus on the small stuff. I mean, if 20% of our actions lead to 80% of our results, then by deduction, that also means that 80% of our actions lead to only 20% of our results, right? And so we want to stay away from those low yield actions as best we can and focus on the heavy hitters, so to speak, that do the majority of the lifting for us. A quick studying example. Let's say you're in a first year computer science class and you have a midterm tomorrow. The professor was awesome enough to send you guys a list of 8 concepts that he thinks you should know in order to do well on the test. Now, two of these concepts are bolded and in very big font. It's super clear the professor wants you to know these the most. Now, in order for you to succeed on the test and get the highest marks as possible, should you divide your time equally between each of these 8 concepts? Is every concept going to provide you with an equal amount of return, so to speak? Probably not. And that's all the Pareto principle really is. Most of you do this already. We recognize that some methods or behaviors produce significantly more results than others. And then we decide to focus on those methods or behaviors in order to get those results. So that takes us to the end of this first video. Here we talked about what our driving force should be when we study, which is efficiency. We then learned about the Pareto principle, which states that roughly 80% of effects come from 20% of causes. And then after that, we applied this Pareto principle to our context of studying or learning by looking at an example. And remember, in our case, the Pareto principle of studying is the notion that 80% of what you ultimately learn comes from just 20% of how you structure your time studying.